Wyoming Territory, late autumn of 1872, just past dawn, the wind howled down from the bighorns and covered the basin in frost. The smell of smoke and blood lingered in the air like a ghost no one could shake. Elias Foster rode hard over the ridge, his coat flapping against his sides, rifle slung across his back. He had seen the plume of smoke from 5 miles out, thin, gray, wrong, not the kind that came from a cook fire. He crested the last rise and pulled his horse to a stop. His jaw tightened. A wagon lay broken in the dry creek bed below, one wheel shattered, canvas torn open. 2 mules lay dead in the traces. No movement. He dismounted, rifle ready, boots crunching against the hard ground as he moved closer. He did not speak. He had learned not to, not until he knew what waited. Then he heard it, a small sound too soft for the wind, a whimper. He stepped around the wagon and stopped cold. A woman lay in the dirt, half covered by a blanket, shaking with fever and clutching a baby close to her chest. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, her skin pale and slick with sweat, hair stuck to her face. The child, no more than a few months old, let out a thin cry, its cheeks red from cold. The woman blinked up at him, dazed. Her lips were cracked. "Please," she rasped, "do not take him." Elias knelt beside her, dropping his rifle. "Lie still," he said, voice low and steady. "I will take care of you." She did not fight him after that. Her eyes fluttered shut. Elias worked fast. He wrapped the baby in his own coat, cradled him against his chest, then lifted the woman as gently as he could and laid her across his saddle. She was burning up. He mounted behind her, holding them both steady, and turned his horse toward the old stage stop 2 miles east. The place had been abandoned years before, but Elias kept it up for days like this. He had no home in town, no family left, just a patch of land and the few things he had managed to hold on to. He rode hard without speaking again, the wind biting at his face. The woman pressed against him, limp as a rag. By the time he reached the cabin, the sky was pale gray. He carried her inside, laid her on the cot, and set the baby in a basket by the fire. The child whimpered but did not wail. Elias set water to boil and stripped the woman's outer clothes, laying a damp cloth on her forehead. She stirred, murmured something he could not hear. He leaned close. "What is your name?" Her eyes opened just enough to meet his. "Gwen," she whispered. "Gwen Prescott?" "Gwen," Elias said, nodding once. "I am Elias Foster. You are safe now." She managed a slow blink before slipping back into the fever. Elias sat back on his heels, rubbing a hand down his face. He had not expected this today. He had not expected, in fact, much of anything lately. He fed the fire, then turned to the baby. The boy's eyes were wide, staring up at him. "You hungry little man," Elias muttered, and set about mixing milk powder with warm water from a tin he kept for passing hands. The child drank greedily. Gwen did not wake again that night. Elias stayed close, changing her cloths, keeping the fire stoked while the wind howled outside. The baby Jacob, she murmured at one point, slept in fits. Waking with thin cries, Elias answered each time. By morning, her fever had broken. She blinked up at the wooden ceiling, squinting at the light. "Where? You are all right," Elias said, crouching beside her again. "I found you by the creek. I brought you here." Gwen turned her head slowly, eyes landing on the basket. "Jacob, he is fine, sleeping again. You kept him warm." She closed her eyes, tears leaking from the corners. "You need food," Elias said. "You need rest. That is all you worry about now." She did not answer for a long time. Then she whispered, "They took everything." Elias said nothing, just waited. "My husband died 2 winters back. I tried to make it on my own. We were headed to Montana. My brother said he would help us, but we were stopped, robbed. They killed the man who was driving the wagon." Her voice cracked and she turned her face away. Elias stood slowly. "You do not need to say more, not now," but she had already said enough. Her hands had been torn up, her dress bloodied. No money, no food left in the wagon, just a broken wheel and 2 dead animals. Elias tended her for the next 3 days. He did not ask questions. He spoke only when needed. Gwen grew stronger with each sunrise. She began to sit up to feed Jacob herself, though her hands still shook. One morning she watched Elias as he chopped wood outside. The leather of his gloves pulled tight around his fingers and his shirt clung to the sweat on his back. He worked in silence, steady and sure. When he came back inside, he caught her watching him. "You should not be on your feet just yet," he said. "I am tired of lying down," she replied. He nodded and handed her a mug. "There is tea in it." She took it carefully, their fingers brushing. "Thank you." They sat in silence for a moment. Jacob gurgled in his basket. "You live out here alone?" she asked. "Near enough." Elias sipped his own mug. "I run cattle down near Powder River, got a small spread. I come up here when winter's close." "No wife," he gave a short laugh. "No, why not?" Elias looked over at her, his face unreadable. "Never found one that would stay." Gwen nodded. She did not press. That night she helped him cook. They shared beans and cornbread and a few strips of dried venison. She laughed when Jacob sneezed into her shoulder. Elias smiled without meaning to. "You are good with him," Gwen said softly. "I had a younger brother. He was sickly when he was small. I used to feed him like that." "What happened to him?" "War," Elias said, the word like a stone. She reached across the table and touched his hand. He looked down at her fingers on his, then back up at her face. "I am glad you are healing. I would not have without you." He stood then, abruptly, and began clearing the plates, but his hands trembled just enough for her to notice. She settled Jacob back into the basket and watched Elias move around the room. The hardness in him was not cruel, it was old, worn down, not sharpened. She understood it. Outside, the wind had quieted. Gwen rose and stepped toward him. "Elias," he turned. She stood close, her eyes steady. "I am not going to Montana anymore." He searched her face. "You do not owe me anything." "I know," she smiled gently, "but I still want to stay." He hesitated. Then he reached out, cupped the side of her face, and leaned forward until his lips met hers, slow, sure, and warm. When they parted, he kept his forehead against hers. "I think I have been waiting a long time for you," he whispered. She nodded, her hand resting over his heart. "I think I was always meant to find you," she said. The days lengthened, each one folded with the quiet rhythm of survival. By the 5th morning, Gwen was strong enough to carry Jacob on her hip and follow Elias to the well behind the cabin. The wind had softened, and the snow that clung to the grass had melted back into the soil, leaving the ground damp and dark beneath their boots. Elias handed her the rope while he crouched to check the bucket's bottom. "You'll need to watch the pull. Last woman who tried yanked too fast and lost the whole thing down the shaft. I'll try not to shame my sex," Gwen said, keeping her voice light. Elias glanced up at her, one corner of his mouth twitching. "Didn't say she was a woman. That was my cousin Daniel." She laughed then, a real, round sound that startled a pair of magpies from the cottonwood above. Jacob blinked at her from her hip, then started chewing the edge of her shawl. "You always this talkative, Elias?" she asked, winding the rope slow and steady. "Only once I know someone won't bolt after hearing my voice. Seems a poor way to live. Didn't say it was a choice." The bucket hit water, and she waited for his nod before pulling it up, her muscles straining by the time it crested the top. Elias steadied it, then poured half into a basin for washing and the rest into the iron pot by the hearth. Back inside, she laid Jacob on a folded quilt and began peeling potatoes while Elias worked a steel file over the edge of a long-handled hoe. "You planning to plant anything this late?" she asked, setting the knife down between slices. "Just fixing it. Got a little patch of kale that might hold if the snow stays off another week. I like keeping my hands busy. That much I've gathered." He didn't look up, but she saw the faint rise of color along his neck. Later that afternoon, Gwen sat on the porch with Jacob resting against her chest, his thumb tucked between his lips. The air smelled of pine, pitch, and wood smoke. Across the clearing, Elias was driving posts into the ground, lining out a pen he said he'd been meaning to finish since spring. "You do all this alone?" Gwen asked once he paused to stretch his back. "Most years. You ever think of hiring someone?" "Tried once. Drank more than he worked, left the gate open twice, nearly lost the whole herd." "You don't trust easy." Elias leaned on the post, squinting into the sun. "You think I'm wrong to be careful?" "No," she said, brushing Jacob's hair back. "Just seems a person might get tired, carrying everything by himself." He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I was tired. Before." That night, she stitched a tear in Elias's shirt while he mended a saddle strap. They sat close enough that their knees touched when one of them shifted. The fire cracked low behind them. "You ever think of leaving Wyoming?" she asked, threading the needle again. "I did once, after the war, thought maybe I'd head east, see the sea." "Why didn't you?" "Didn't feel right. Places get into your blood." This one did. She folded the shirt neatly and handed it to him. "I never saw the ocean either." Elias met her eyes. "Would you still want to?" "Maybe," she said slowly. "But I think I'd rather see spring here first." He didn't touch her, not yet, but the look he gave her then made her breath catch in her throat. The next morning, Gwen woke early. The cabin was dim, the coals still warm. She slipped on her boots and stepped out into the cold, drawing her shawl tight. Elias was already in the paddock, checking the fencing. She walked to him, boots crunching softly in the grass. "You always up before the sun?" He glanced over. "Not always. Just when there's something worth waking for." She didn't answer, just leaned on the rail beside him and watched the sky turn pink at the edges. Later that day, he showed her the lean to where he kept the tack and tools. Jacob slept wrapped in wool, curled beside the hearth. "This place," Gwen said, running her fingers over a bridle hook, "it's plain, but it feels steady." I needed steady. I'd had enough of the rest. She turned to him. "Did you ever think you'd have more than that?" He looked down at his hands. "I stopped hoping for more." Gwen stepped closer. "I didn't, not even when I was alone in that wagon." Elias looked at her then, and something shifted between them, slow as thaw. He reached for her hand, not in haste, but like he'd been waiting to be sure. "Then maybe we both deserve more than just steady," he said. She nodded, her fingers tightening around his, and behind them the wind stirred the trees, but the air inside the lean-to held still. By the time December settled in, the earth had hardened beneath a thin crust of snow. The cabin walls held against the wind, but the cold still crept through the seams. Each morning, Elias lit the stove before Gwen stirred, and her hands, steady now, wrapped Jacob in layers of wool before she stepped outside to gather wood or shake the snow from the wash line. The rhythm of their days had deepened into something unspoken, shared chores, quiet meals, the soft weight of Jacob asleep between them when he fussed through the night. No promises had been made, but they moved around one another like a pair long used to the same path. One morning, Elias returned from the lower pasture with his coat stiff from frost and a gash across his hand. Gwen was at the table, mending one of Jacob's shirts. "What happened?" she asked, setting the needle aside. "Wire snapped while I was tightening the fence." "Caught me wrong." She took his hand gently, frowning at the dirt and blood. "You didn't wrap it." "I rinsed it in the creek." "That's not enough." She guided him to sit, fetched a basin of hot water, and began cleaning the wound. He flinched when the cloth touched raw skin but didn't pull away. "You've done this before." Gwen didn't look up. "My father ran a tannery. Tools slipped often. I learned how to stop a man from losing a finger before I could read." Her fingers worked with calm precision, wrapping the cloth snug. "You'll need to keep it dry." "I'll manage." She tied it off, then rested his hand on his knee. "You don't have to do everything alone." Elias looked at her, his voice low. "I'm still learning how not to." That night, after the baby had been laid down, they sat in the hush of the firelight. Gwen worked a length of yarn into a small cap for Jacob, her fingers looping slowly. Elias repaired a buckle on one of his saddle bags, the leather worn but still strong. "You ever think about the spring?" she asked, not looking up. "I think about the calves that'll need branding, the creek that'll flood once the snow melts, the roof that'll leak again." "What about beyond that? A year from now?" Elias rubbed his thumb over the edge of the buckle. "I never used to. Days were enough. And now," he set the strap down, leaning forward, "now I think about what kind of life I could build with you if you wanted it." Gwen placed the half-finished cap on the table. "I want it." He reached for her hand across the space between them. "Then we'll make it." Together, in the days that followed, they began to speak of the future in pieces. Elias showed her a hollow behind the cabin where the soil stayed soft come early thaw. "Good for carrots," he said, and she nodded, already marking the rows in her mind. Gwen found a flat spot near the door where she could set a bench come warmer weather, a place to sit with Jacob in the sun. "I'll teach him to read out here," she said. "Once he's old enough to sit still." Elias smiled, a quiet pride in his eyes. "He'll be smart." He's already watching everything. One afternoon, they rode out with Jacob bundled in a sling against Gwen's chest. The land stretched wide and gold beneath the winter sun. Elias stopped near a rise and pointed toward a patch of earth ringed by cottonwoods. "If we ever needed more room," he said, "that'd be the place to build." Gwen turned in the saddle, the boy warm against her. "You'd want that, a bigger home," he met her gaze, "if it meant you stayed." She reached for his hand, gloved and rough. "I'm not going anywhere, Elias." That night, as snow began to fall again in slow, heavy flakes, Elias took a small wooden box from the shelf above the hearth. He opened it carefully and removed a narrow gold ring, its band worn smooth. "My mother's," he said, holding it out. "She wore it until the day she died." Gwen stared, her breath catching. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." She took the ring with trembling fingers and he slid it onto her hand. It fit as if it had always belonged there. Outside, the wind passed over the cabin like a long, quiet sigh. Inside, the fire burned steady, and in its warmth a family began. No vows spoken, no preacher called, only two hearts choosing a life one day at a time with hands and trust and the long patience of love. The slope behind the cabin caught the morning light first, long before it reached the valley floor. Gwen stood at the window, her shawl pulled around her shoulders, watching the pale gold stretch down over the snow-speckled field. Jacob stirred in the cradle Elias had built from pine boards the week before, the wood sanded smooth, corners rounded with care. Elias stepped in from the lean-to, hanging his coat on the peg by the door. His boots tracked snow across the floorboards, but Gwen didn't mention it. "There's a fox den by the east ridge," he said, brushing his hands off. "Saw the prints." She kept her eyes on the glass. "Foxes don't usually come that close to a homestead. Not unless they're hungry." Jacob gave a small, hiccuped cough and Gwen moved to him, lifting him against her shoulder. Elias watched her a moment, then crossed to the stove and opened the damper wider. "You ever trap?" she asked. "Used to. Mostly for pelts. My father taught me how to skin and stretch proper. Haven't in years." He paused. "Don't like killing what don't need killing," she nodded, settling into the rocking chair. "I used to watch my uncle set rabbit snares. He'd whistle while he did it. Said it kept the spirits of the forest from following him home." Elias looked over, a quiet grin in his eyes. "Did it work?" He died of gout, not ghosts. The wind rattled the shutters once before falling still. Elias sat across from her, resting his forearms on his knees. "There's a wagon coming," he said. "I saw smoke from the trail heading south, about a day out." Gwen's brow furrowed. "You think it's your supply man? Could be. Could be someone else. Should we be worried? I'll have the rifle ready just in case." She didn't answer right away, just shifted Jacob to her other arm. "I worry sometimes," she said softly, "about what might come looking for me, what I left behind." Elias met her eyes. "If it comes, it'll find both of us standing." Gwen looked down at the baby, then back up. "If they come for Jacob, they won't take him," Elias said. "Not while I'm breathing." That night, she couldn't sleep. She stepped outside, wrapped in Elias's coat, the sky above clear and brittle with stars. The horses stood quiet in the paddock, their breath rising like smoke. She didn't hear Elias approach, but his hand found hers in the dark. "You always walk when you can't sleep?" he asked, voice low. "Used to," she squeezed his fingers. "Back when I had too many thoughts and not enough answers. Get any closer to answers now?" She tilted her head back, gaze on the stars. "Closer than I ever thought I'd get." They stood there in silence, the snow crunching faintly as a breeze moved across the field. Elias's voice came quiet. "I'd like to make your name mine, if you'd have it." She looked at him then, the weight of the moment pressing warm into her chest. "You asking me to marry you, Elias Foster?" "I am." She didn't hesitate. "Then yes, I will." He leaned in, slow and sure, and kissed her beneath the stars, his hand still wrapped around hers. The next morning, they loaded the wagon with supplies from the cellar, dried beans, smoked pork, a few tins of molasses, and headed toward the ridge to meet whoever was coming down the trail. Jacob lay bundled between them, tucked in a wool blanket. As they rode, Gwen rested her head against Elias's shoulder, the sway of the wagon steady beneath her. "I never imagined this," she murmured. "What peace in winter. Elias looked out over the land, the soft hush of snow stretching wide beneath the sun. Then it's ours to keep. And they rode on toward the smoke, toward whatever waited, their hands joined between them. The wagon reached the lower trail just before noon. Sunlight glinted off the snow-crusted pines, and the wheels creaked in protest each time they hit a frozen rut. Gwen held Jacob snug beneath her cloak, her gaze scanning the narrow road ahead. Elias slowed the team as movement flickered in the distance, a small wagon, canvas bowed under weight, drawn by a pair of tired-looking bays. A man sat hunched at the reins, bundled in a patched wool coat with a younger woman beside him. No weapons drawn, no sign of trouble. Still, Elias kept his rifle resting across his lap. When the two wagons met, the man raised a hand in greeting. "Didn't expect to see another soul out here," he said, voice hoarse with cold. "You Foster?" "I am," Elias answered, eyes steady. The woman beside him adjusted her bonnet, revealing wind-chapped cheeks and a face etched with worry. "We were told you might trade for goods." "We lost the wheel off our supply cart a week back and had to leave near half of what we had." Elias nodded toward the back of his wagon. "Got dried meat and beans, some flour left. What are you offering?" The man glanced at the crates behind him. "Tools, iron nails hand-forged." "A grindstone if you've got use for it." Elias's gaze flicked to Gwen, then back. "I've use for it. You'll come back with us, rest the horses. We'll talk inside." They made the ride in silence, the strangers trailing behind. Gwen watched Elias's hands on the reins, calm but not relaxed. He didn't trust quick. She rested her hand over his and he didn't pull away. At the homestead, Elias had the couple stable their horses and brought them inside. Gwen offered them warm cider and set Jacob in his cradle, where he blinked up at the rafters without fussing. The woman, who introduced herself as Mabel, accepted a cup with both hands. "You've a good place here," she said. "Solid, feels lived in." "We've only just begun living in it," Gwen answered, careful but not cold. Mabel's eyes drifted to Jacob, then back. "You've made it yours already." Later, Elias inspected the grindstone while Gwen looked through the tools. She found a drawknife with a good handle and a box of beeswax candles, still firm and fragrant. They made a fair trade, and the couple planned to move on the next morning with a sack of provisions and one of Elias's spare wheels strapped to their cart. That night, after their guests had gone to the loft to sleep, Gwen sat with Elias by the stove, her feet tucked under her. "They seemed honest," she said. "They were," Elias replied. "But I'm glad they're moving on." She reached for his hand. "You ever wonder if we'll have to move again?" He didn't answer at first, then, "Only if we're forced, and even then not far." "I'd rather build deeper than run." Gwen leaned against him, her head resting beneath his chin. "I want to plant roots here, raise Jacob where the land knows our names." "You will," he said. "We both will." When spring came, the ground softened and the creek rose, just as Elias had said it would. They built a chicken coop and dug a new wellhead, and Gwen marked out garden beds with twine and stakes. Jacob had grown enough to sit in the dirt while she worked, his hands full of twigs and pebbles. One evening, Elias returned from the far pasture carrying a burlap sack full of sprouting potatoes. Gwen met him at the fence, brushing dirt from her skirt. "From the north edge," he said. "Planted themselves last year, it seems. We'll call them our gift crop," she smiled. "Let's put them near the patch we cleared by the slope." They worked until the light faded, then made supper together. Jacob babbled from his seat near the hearth, and Elias handed Gwen a plate with a quiet contentment that had taken root in him slowly but fully. As summer came, the valley bloomed. Wildflowers crept up the hillside, and the air carried the hum of bees and the distant lowing of cattle. They rode out in the evenings, sometimes Elias with one hand on the reins, Gwen beside him with Jacob asleep against her chest, the land stretching open and sure beneath them. In July, they stood under the cottonwood tree behind the cabin with a traveling preacher and said their vows. No guests but the wind and the sky and the boy in Gwen's arms. Elias wore his cleanest shirt, and Gwen had sewn a ribbon into her hair. He gave her a gold band to match the one she already wore, and she gave him a kiss that lingered like sunlight on water. That night, after Jacob had been laid down, they sat in the doorway watching the moon rise over the ridge. Elias's arm wrapped around her waist, and her fingers traced slow circles on his knee. "You ever think you'd be a husband?" she asked, voice low. "I stopped thinking about it before I ever got the chance. And now I can't imagine being anything else." She turned to face him, her cheek brushing his. "I love you, Elias." His breath caught just slightly before he answered. "I love you too, Gwen. More than I've ever known how to say." "You just did." They stayed like that until the stars wheeled overhead, the night warm and full. Years passed. Jacob learned to walk, then run, then ride. He helped Elias mend fences and followed Gwen through the garden rows. He called her Mama with ease and Elias Pa with pride. The land grew with them, orchards planted, a second room added to the cabin, a new barn raised with neighbors' help. Every change was built with their hands, every joy earned, every sorrow faced side by side. And through it all, their love held quiet, enduring, unshaken. A kind of love that didn't need grand words or promises, only the steady presence of each other and the life they chose to build. By the time Jacob was old enough to help drive the cattle to market, folks in town called the place Foster Hollow. They said it was a good homestead, tight run, honest and warm, and anyone who passed through knew it wasn't the land alone that made it that way, but the people who lived on it. A man who had once thought nothing waited for him, and a woman who had refused to stop hoping. Together they had made a home, and they never left it, not once, not ever.